When I was 15 and female, I traveled with two friends who were both the same age. We took the train to get to an event a few hours away. We were only interested in working in the healthcare, and we were going to see what it's like to work in this field event in another city. After the event ended, we didn't have long to get to the train station to catch our train home. Because of this, we had pre-booked and I think prepaid for a taxi from the venue straight to the train station. This was in the days before Uber existed. When the event ended in the evening, it finished slightly late by the way, we rushed out to find our taxi. We approached one that appeared to be waiting for someone specifically. We had seen the driver turn away multiple other people. Of course, we asked him, "Hey, is this the taxi for bar named to the train station?" The taxi driver said yes. And we all quickly jumped in. After 10 minutes of driving though, my friend got a call from the taxi company. They said our pre-booked taxi was back at the venue looking for us. We realized that whoever this guy is currently driving us was not the taxi driver we'd booked. I asked the driver to turn around. He just glared at me and said, "I'm not doing that." Immediately, he locked the doors. And we started protesting, telling him to stop and that this wasn't our taxi, that he had lied to us that it was, but he refused to do so. My friend started panicking and hyperventilating. She whispered in my ear, "I think he's gonna kill us." Probably an overreaction, maybe. But we were young and far away from any hub. The man started screaming that he was not going to let us out and we were in his car now. Eventually, I threatened to call the police, at which point he braked very sharply and told us to get out. He left us at the side of the road and sped off in a hurry. And the road was completely deserted. It was a dark winter evening and we were all pretty freaked out. My friend called the book taxi and they picked us up and took us to the station properly. We didn't manage to get the fake taxi's number or any information from the car itself. Now in my mid-20s, I always make sure to carefully check the number plate on any apps to make sure it's the right car picking us up. Growing up in the 90s, my mom was always very protective towards my sister and me. Most of the time it seemed to us like overkill. We were sheltered girls. But there was one incident from my childhood that really makes me glad my mom never dropped her guard even once. I was a preteen, probably 10 or 11 years old at the time. My mom and I had just finished doing some shopping at Sam's Club, and we'd stopped at Wendy's for an early dinner. To my eyes, nothing unusual had happened. We stood in line, we ordered the food, we ate, and then we left. We were walking in the parking lot and had almost made it back to the minivan when my mom said sort of loudly that she should probably go to the bathroom before driving home. I remember thinking that this was a bit weird because we weren't all that far away. I was just old enough that sometimes if my mom had to run into a store briefly about 5 minutes or so, she would give me the keys and let me sit in the locked van and read. The back windows were tinted, so it was hard to see inside the car. She would always rush through her business and come jogging back to the van to minimize the time she left me alone. I asked her if I can have the keys. She said no. She thought I ought to try to use the bathroom too. I remember telling her that I didn't have to go, and through gritted teeth, she told me to try anyway. On our way back into the restaurant, we passed by this middle-aged man. He was a bit dirty looking, as if he'd spent all day welding or working on cars. He was of average height, was thin, and had long gray hair. Nothing about him was remarkable to me, and you only made brief eye contact with us as we turned around. He was heading to a pickup truck parked in the front of the lot, while we were parked more toward the left side of the building. When we got back inside, my mom didn't head towards the bathroom, but instead led me to a table and sat down. "Aren't we going to the restroom?" I asked. "No." My mom said, "We're waiting here until that guy leaves." She was talking about the man that walked out behind us, adding to that red pickup truck. Aside from his griminess, he didn't seem that weird to me. I thought my mom was making a snap judgment. "Why?" I asked. I kept catching him staring at us in line. He would always look at you, and look away, and look back. Then he left right after we did something doesn't feel right. I'd rather be safe than sorry. I told her I hadn't noticed anything, and asked if I could get a Frosty while we waited. My mom was looking down into her wallet to see if she had cash from ice cream, when the red pickup truck rolled by the front window. It drove by extremely slowly. The man in the driver's seat was turned so his shoulders were almost square with the restaurant as he passed by. He was staring and his eyes were clearly searching for something. And then they found me. I'll never forget the way he stared at me for the whole length of his passing by the window before accelerating to normal speed and driving away. I'm 33 now, and I still get the chills when I think about that day, about that man's stare and the way my mom checked her mirrors for a red pickup truck, but the whole drive home. Growing up in a working-class Latino family, we didn't have the luxury of taking lavish vacations throughout the year. That didn't stop us from exploring the natural wonders of Southern California though, who camping at a young age, my sister and I understood the true value of camping through our shared respect for Mother Nature. Over time we mastered surviving in the outdoors so much that we desired to explore new campgrounds throughout the state. On one such occasion, a co-worker of my father overheard him talking about his summer vacation plans and suggested to him a new campground that checked out. To this day my parents nor I are unable to remember the name of this campsite. We all agree it was summer in the hills of the San Diego County, though my father was excited for the prospect of visiting a new national park and packed up the car for the customary family summer retreat. The drive up to the campsite was quite long and dangerous, even though we were driving during the day. The steepness of the mountainside, coupled with the numerous blind turns, had everyone sitting on the edge of their seats. Arguments soon erupted among us, as we didn't find any signs indicating where to go. This was in the age before smartphones and GPS and all that. Eventually, we convinced our father to stop and ask for some directions. As the campground eventually came into view, we all let out a collective sigh of relief. We had made it, yet this place didn't look like a national park at all. There wasn't a ranger station or a welcome center anywhere in sight. The lake appeared to be a murky bog, whereas the campground itself was devoid of all life, a proverbial ghost town, with the only inhabitants being us. Putting our bewilderment beside us, though we cautiously surveyed the area, finding any clues that would guide us to the keeper of this place. Out in the distance, we saw a crumbling open sign dangling in the window of a dilapidated diner, just as the sign implied. We entered the establishment to inquire about this place. Pushing the creaking door open, we were greeted by the owner of said diner, a gaunt-looking man who I would say was plucked straight out of the movie The Hills Have Eyes. Well, hey there. How can I help all you fine folks on this fine day? My dad told them we'd made some reservations to camp here, but we were not sure if this was the right place to go. We handed the man our booking papers for him to inspect. He replied very swiftly, Yeah, you have the right place on the groundskeeper this here national park. Let me finish up some paperwork on my end and now get things all sorted out for you and your family. He wobbled off to the back of the diner. My sister and I retreated to the safety of our car. Although we were children at the time, we both felt a sense of unease and even dread at the thought of spending the night here. Despite our worries, our parents reassured us the vacation had only just begun, albeit with a few bumps along the way. And as we entered the site, all our concerns were tossed out the window. It was time to transform this empty lot into our secure camp. Meant the rest of the day came and went as our campsite began to take shape. The sounds of our radio, along with the rhythmic thing of hammers, were the only sounds greeting us as the sun began to set. This detail really stood out to me. It was early July here in Southern California, and there were always people camping around this time. In either case, we brushed everything aside and thought that surely more people would arrive by tomorrow, and they did. On the following day of the trip, my father went fishing at the lake. Molly was off on his own adventure. My sister and I decided it was time to have one of our own. Recruiting the aid of our mother, we set out to explore the rest of the campgrounds, to our surprise and elation. We discovered this campground had its own swimming pool. With our minds made up, the three of us got into our bathing suits, slathered on some sunscreen, and made our way down to the pool. Soon my sister and I were splashing around the water without a care in the world. That was until I noticed three suspicious men dressed entirely in black. They came and sat down at one of the chairs at the opposite end of the pool from where our mother was watching us at. And first, I thought the men were new campers that are recently arrived at the grounds to examine the swimming pool as well. But much to my dismay, the men huddled around each other and started to whisper. They were staring intently at the two of us. My mother's instincts caught on to this predatory behavior, and she decided to cut our little swimming excursion short. When my father arrived from the lake, he reported that he was unable to catch any fish, and that the fish he did find were all belly up and dead in the water. My mother informed my father of the three suspicious-looking men are young, my sister and I are at the pool. This infuriated him. My father brandished his machete and stormed out in search of the group, presumably to try and talk some sense into them. Some time passed by, and my father arrived back at the campsite. Dismayed that he did not find them, and he only saw a mother and her two little boys. This point may sound insignificant at first, but it will become important later in the story. As night fell, my sister and I were preparing to go to sleep when we were jolted awake by the pleading screams of a woman. Our pleas were joined by the cries of two young children. We could hear various male voices demanding their silence. My father recognized the woman's voice as the mother he saw earlier in the day, camping alone with her two kids. My father was a former Marine, so he loaded up his rifle and his concealed hunting knife and then proceeded to tell my mother to take care of us. He handed her a loaded gun as well. I saw my father heading out toward the campsite with a mother and her children were staying. My sister and I were petrified when we noticed the terror-stricken look on our mother's face. The yelling escalated, and thunderous beings from the rifle rang out that seemed to put an end to the chaos. We heard the crackling branches closing in, as someone was clearly moving quickly towards us. My mother's eyes went wide and her knuckles clenched. She aimed the gun into the darkness, ready to protect us at all costs. To our relief, though, my father emerged from the shadows with a fearful mother and her two sobbing children in tow. My father claimed he'd scared off the men who were harassing us at the pool and would be helping the mother pack her things to leave. My father even offered to follow her in our car until she got to the main highway. In a moment of reprieve, the woman held her children tight. We all assured her that their safety was of the utmost importance. Putting pleasantries aside, my father departed yet again to help the mother pack up her campsite and leave this backwater excuse for a national park. The rays of sunlight streaming into our tent eventually signaled the start of a new day. Since our father had left with Squirt that small family from the imminent danger, my sister and I started to pack up camp, knowing all too well that none of us wanted to risk our lives spending another night at this place. I was making my way back to the bathrooms when I got the glimpse of our car slowly making its way back to camp. I ran back to tell my mother and sister, noticed the car and the bloodshot eyes of my father behind the wheel. He exited and informed us the mother and her children had made it safely to the highway. This was then followed by a long pause. Now let's get the hell out of here ourselves. With that, we took all our possessions and packed up the rest of our camping gear before leaving that godforsaken place behind. My father informed the owner of the diner about what happened last night and about the three suspicious men. The only thing the emaciated-looking man said in response was, "Well, it's a damn shame you and your family can't stay here for a little longer." We then hightail it out of there like bats out of hell, vowing to never return. Ever since this harrowing experience, my family and I have been unable to get my sister to go camping again. And as time went on, I decided to ask my father where he had heard about that awful place in the first place. He added a new detail he had not previously disclosed. He mentioned that upon returning to work, he wanted to confront that co-worker about the horrible camping recommendation he gave. When he tried to locate him though, another coworker said the same man had quit just a couple of days before my father was going to return from vacation. So I was staying at my aunt's apartment one day because my mom had to go to a doctor's appointment and run some errands. She didn't want to leave us home alone. My brother and I were around 6 and 8 years old, respectively. We were there for a few hours when we heard a very powerful knock at the door. My aunt went to go check the door wasn't locked though. So before she even got there, one of her old exes walked in forcefully and rushed straight at her. He picked her up and slammed her down to the floor and started beating her. We just stood there in shock, not knowing what to do. We watched as she screamed for help, and the men continued attacking her. Luckily, in one of the neighboring apartments, 3 younger guys in their 20s heard her screams for help. They rushed over, and as they saw on the scene, they immediately began beating the living crap out of that guy. He was beaten so badly that he was bruised all over and was bleeding from various places. He had been knocked out cold and had to be taken away in a stretcher shortly after they have locked him up for assault. We were extremely grateful that those guys were there. Who knows what would have happened if they weren't? He probably would have killed our aunt and then killed us too. My aunt is okay now and is thankfully happily married. I, 23 and female, was at the gym doing some cardio on a treadmill. It was pretty empty and not very many people were there. After all, it was a Thursday at noon. I always used the treadmills in front of the mirrors so I can pay attention to my surroundings. I was on a treadmill 2 away from the end. All of them were empty, save for one at the opposite end of where I was. This man just jumped onto the treadmill right next to me. It was kind of weird, but whatever. I had my headphones in and was listening to some Criminal Minds. Every so often I would look up at the mirrors just to check my surroundings. Every time I would look up though, this man would just be dead-eyed staring at me. Around 37 by 45-minute planned cardio went by when he dropped his phone on the side of his treadmill closest to me. I was watching the mirror in that moment and saw him basically throw it at me. He got off the treadmill, picked his phone up, and then tapped me on the shoulder. Now I never took out my headphones, so I couldn't really understand what he was saying. He introduced himself, but I didn't catch his name, and then asked me my name. I sort of mumbled a fake one. He then said something else I couldn't hear because there was a shootout going on in the TV show, and just nodded and returned to my show. Clearly uninterested in whatever it was he was saying. At this point, I only had 5 minutes left. Anyway, every time I looked up in the mirror, he was still staring at me. I finished my workout and went to the stretching area that was near the treadmills, still in front of those mirrors. I took a glance at how long he'd been on. It was something like 8 minutes, not actually long enough to get a real workout, or even honestly a warm-up either. When I moved to the stretching area, he immediately moved to the closest machine and continued staring at me. Using the mirror, I started counting his sets and reps in the middle of his neck, so I got up and left thinking that would give me enough time to get out to my car and leave before he noticed was gone. I got to my car and sat down, turned it on, and grabbed my seatbelt. I was about to click it into place when suddenly my passenger side door opened. I yelled out, "Don't touch my fucking car." I pulled out of that parking spot with both doors still open. I drove a mile down the road with my passenger door still swinging back and forth. The next day I went into the gym to report the guy. But like I said, I'd never gotten his name. The gym didn't want to look at the cameras with me there and said that once they figured out what it was, they would talk to him, and really didn't feel like they were going to do anything about the situation. The very next week, I canceled my membership, and I never went back there. My friend and I were heading back to his house around 11 p.m. The route we took involved getting on the freeway for about 30 seconds into a part where cars had the option to switch lanes and continue on the freeway or stay in the current lane and take another exit. May was a pretty common route in the area. So I was kind of on autopilot after we got off the freeway. After about 10 minutes though, my friend suddenly told me to get into another lane without signaling right now. I complied since he sounded so urgent, but I was confused. My friend hated people who don't signal. He told me to keep driving, but that there was a car that had been following us ever since we'd gotten off the freeway. And he was trying to figure out if it was just a coincidence or not. Next, he told me to suddenly drop about 20 miles below the speed limit. Crap, so did the car behind us. The other cars all got into the other lane and passed me by. But that car kept perfect pace. The final test was getting into a turning lane and suddenly going straight ahead instead. There were no other cars around us. At this point, the car behind us copied every single move. They must have realized we'd noticed them following us. They suddenly sped up and zoomed past us after having followed us for the last 15 minutes. We weren't able to get a good look at the people inside the car. And we didn't recognize the car either. I can only assume they had malicious intentions. I turned onto a random street to see if they'd come back. But after 5 minutes, no other cars passed by. It's been about 5 years since then. But I'm hyper-vigilant about checking my rear-view mirror when I'm driving. I feel like a creeper when I notice on taking the same route as the car in front of me and try to switch lanes or at least let some cars come in between us. Although it hasn't happened again. I still remember that night vividly and wonder what would have happened if my friend wasn't paying attention either. I'm an immigrant from Belarus. So being English is not my first language. I apologize if I phrase some things quite weirdly. Here's some backstory. I was only 11 when my family left the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My father was involved with the Communist Party and would frequently visit Moscow when I was a boy. I don't know all the details. I don't even know what exactly my father's role was in the USSR. From what I understand, we had been granted asylum in the United States and had to flee Belarus in 1991. That's not really why I'm writing this story though. This is about something I saw in my childhood that has scarred me for life. This took place roughly a year before we left. I'm guessing it must have been 1990. My family like many others lived in a massive apartment building in Minsk. There were 2 other identical apartment buildings adjacent to ours. And directly behind the buildings was a playground area where I would often play with my friends Sasha and Victor. And beyond the playground was a section of trees that separated a shopping plaza from the apartment grounds. I remember my mother was feeling ill and was bedridden, and my father was away on business in Moscow. I was pretty much all on my own that night. I remember that I had gotten bored watching TV in the living room and decided to go outside and see if any of my friends were at the playground. I would say this was around 8 p.m. or so. It was quite dark out by then. And most of the children were inside. I don't think anyone would have even been allowed on the playground at that time. But I didn't care. It's not like there was anyone around to tell me to go back inside, and was pretty excited to have the playground all to myself. It was a bit chilly out that night, but it was not exactly snowing. I figured I would play on the slides and swing set until either I got bored or security came along and told me to go back inside. There I was just swinging in the dark. When I heard something near the fence that separated the trees from the playground. It was a strange noise like someone was sawing wood, but there was something off about it. I ignored the sound at first, but it became louder as time passed by, and was to the point where I became extremely curious what was causing this strange noise. There were no lights at the playground itself. But there were lights mounted to the back of the apartment buildings and illuminated things, just enough to where you could see your surroundings. But the trees beyond the fence were pitch black. I got off the swing set and approached the edge of the playground. The sound continued getting louder even as I got right up to the fence. It wasn't until I let out a curious "hello" that the noise immediately ceased. I stood there staring into the dark tree line waiting for any response. Everything remained silent. After about another minute passed by, I innocently called out again. "Why are you chopping down trees in the dark?" I heard a shuffling from within the trees. And soon I saw a dark figure come into view. They did not step out from the tree line though. What happened next is something that still makes me want to vomit out my insides. A dark figure threw something. The object flew over the fence and smacked me directly in the chest. I was knocked backward, more out of surprise than an actual force of the impact. "Hey, why'd you do that?" Before I could get another word out, I caught a glimpse of what exactly had been thrown at me. It was a severed human arm laying on the ground in front of Bay. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran back toward the apartments, bawling my eyes out. I stormed into our apartment and sat on the living room couch to collect myself. I did think about waking my sick mother and telling her what happened, but decided against it. To give you some perspective, my mother grew up in Siberia and she could be quite ruthless at times. Not only would she not be too happy about being woken up, but she wouldn't believe my story either. I probably wouldn't be able to sit down for a week if she found out I left that apartment alone after dark. I kept the incident to myself. As a child, I understood that what happened was scary, but I had no grasp of the further implications. I thought there was a monster in the woods who ate people who came out after dark. Now that I'm an adult, though, there are some things I've come to realize for our remaining time in Belarus. I never saw or heard of any kind of investigation regarding a missing person or a mutilated body being discovered. I guess that's nothing out of the ordinary living in Soviet society. The monster in the woods, hiding in the trees that night, was most likely a sadistic madman dismembering a human body with a hacksaw. There is one more thing I should mention, are the rest of the time that we lived there. I cannot for the life of me recall ever having seen my friend Sasha again, not after that night at least,